workshop series is coming up with kind of a step-by-step plan of how to get ready. So I'll go ahead and jump in. Today, we're going to talk about statements of purpose and CVs or resumes. So I think one thing that really went through my mind during this process is just like, is this right? Like, am I doing this the way that I'm supposed to be doing it? Because I really, being a first generation graduate student, didn't have much to go on, right? So I really relied on other people that had been there before or professors to kind of help steer the path. And that's not always available to everybody. I really had to seek out support when I was applying to grad school. So just as we go, please put questions in the chat as they come up for you. We may get to them during, we might do them at the end, not really sure, but that way you don't lose them, right? So feel free to put any questions in the chat. I definitely want to make time for Q&A because I think this topic, beyond everything we've talked about this semester, is really ripe for your specific questions and kind of getting that answered. Okay, so big picture, this was the most agonizing part of the whole process for me, was writing my statement, because it's so personal, right? It's the most personal piece that you're going to submit in your application packet. And you want it to be right. There's all these like warnings out there, you know, you can't have any spelling errors, etc. And while some of that's true, I definitely had spelling errors and still got invitations for interviews, just to put that out there. I realized it later that you spell ladder with 2 T's, not 1 T, because that's later anyway. So it was really agonizing, and I just kind of want to put out there that this is going to feel stressful, and that's okay. And I think the thing that you can do to offset that stress, if at all possible, is to start as soon as possible. I think it's really easy to put this piece off to the end. It's a little easier to work on studying for the GRE because it's so straightforward. You know what you have to do to study for the GRE. This part can feel really murky. Like, what do I even do? So the sooner you just get words on the page, the better, or an outline, or even using, going off on a tangent here, but Word now has a function where you can speak to text, or using your phone when you're waiting in line and do voice memos. That's how I wrote almost my whole thesis. It's like just, you know, writing or talking out ideas when they came to me, and then it made it a lot easier to sit down and write. And then the more eyes, the better, with a caveat. Not everybody's going to be qualified to give you good feedback. And so keep that in mind. You know, I remember showing stuff to my parents, and their feedback was so off base that it was almost hard. It made it really uncomfortable for everybody. So I wouldn't show my parents the statement in hindsight, but for sure peers and whatnot, we'll get into that. So, but the more eyes, the better. And that can feel, that first time you hand it out is really stressful, because you're like, it's so personal, and to hand that to someone to read can feel really big. Okay, so first off, what's the difference between a statement of purpose and a personal statement? And the truth is not much, and that can be really frustrating. So sometimes programs will use these terms interchangeably. So one program may ask for a statement of purpose and the other asks for a personal statement, and you can submit pretty much the same thing, and that's fine. However, technically there is a difference. So for the most part, you're going to be asked for statements of purpose in graduate school, and I'll go into that more specifically. And personal statements are more about your academic career and can be more personal. Statements of purpose tend to be less personal and more factual, but they also get at, where do you want to go? What are your interests? What's the next step? So like I said, there's a lot of overlap, but they are technically different. So a statement of purpose, what you want to know here is that you're demonstrating your achievements and your promise for graduate studies, right? So I think the hardest part about this statement is recognizing that the admissions committee does not expect you to already be doing graduate level work. You are not showing that you are a graduate student. You're showing the promise for graduate study. And I think that's really intimidating. You're like, gosh, I'm not good enough when you're writing the statement, but really you are. You're just showing that you can do it, not that you have done it. Of course, you're not expected to have already done a bunch of the stuff that you're going to do in grad school. I think that was the hard part for me when I finally got over that like mental hurdle that, oh, okay, right, I'm not expected to actually be doing graduate level work. Then it became a lot easier to just say like, here's what I've done in undergrad and here's why this has prepared me to now take on the next step. So the first part, I think it's easy to break these down into 4 parts and just kind of outline these individual parts. Don't worry about how they go together quite yet. But just kind of get down on paper, what do you want to convey to a graduate committee? And the first is just your introduction. Who are you? What are your interests? Keep this short though. This should be no more than 2 paragraphs. Usually it's just the first paragraph, like an opening paragraph. This can oftentimes be talked about as your hook at the beginning, and don't stress about the hook. I think I spent a lot of time stressing about the hook and didn't get to the writing. And it was a really nice distraction to be like, well, but what's my hook? And ultimately I didn't have a hook. I'll show you my statement and there's no hook. And it was fine. So this is usually what sparked your desire for graduate studies, your interests. I've seen some really good ones, but they have to kind of be authentic to be that good. Like one of them I read was, you know, I was 11 and I made my own little library and I realized that like I was so passionate about organizing books and keeping, you know, I want to be a librarian and do library studies. And like, okay, cool. But I didn't do that. I didn't know at 11 that I was going to be a graduate student. So for me, it just didn't make sense. For you, it might. If you know what you want to do and you've known for a while, and this is just an obvious next step for you, you might have a hook, but not everybody has to have a hook. Okay, so previous studies. So most programs, and we can talk about when we don't in the discussion when this isn't the case, but most programs are research-based. So because of that, you want to emphasize your research experience, papers or theses that you've done in undergrad, extracurricular scholarly work. That's usually research labs, and then relevant work experience, right? And so, and then this can shift a little bit if it's a really applied master's program. Same idea, previous experience, just less previous studies, right? Talking about what experiences you've had and coursework that's prepared you for the graduate program. Okay, part 3, recent and current activities. So here's my past, now here's what I'm doing now. Real simple. This is especially relevant if you've taken gap years. So how has your work or volunteer experience added to your skills or helped you focus on what you want to do for grad school? So sometimes your work experience might not be perfectly aligned, and that's okay, as long as you can really talk about, and here's what I learned I do want, you know, so maybe you did this one thing and you learned you don't want to do X, but now you do know you want to do Y. And so that's why you're applying to this graduate program. Preferably try to get your work experience that has some sort of parallel or some sort of connection though to what you're considering for grad school or the different routes you're considering. If you can't and you just need a paycheck, which I totally get and totally did, for a minute there, you know, at least continue to volunteer or do something that relates to what you want to do. Have something to talk about in your gap years. And we can talk more about that if anyone wants. I know a lot of people plan on doing gap years, so please feel free to put those questions in the chat. And then the last part, this is actually probably the easiest part to write. So sometimes you might want to start here, which is like, why do you want to do grad school, right? Why are you even applying? This is the part where you convince the faculty that you know what's going on in your field and how you fit into that, right? How do your interests fit into the field? Be specific if you know this information. And also, you know, if it's a mentor model, which most programs still are, if it's a PhD level, not so much at the master's level, almost rarely, I'd say at the master's level. but you really want to emphasize how your research fits in with that faculty member. I think a common flaw here is thinking that you have to have the exact same research interests as the mentor, and that's not true. You just need to have alignment, because ultimately, hopefully, the faculty member you want to work with is not interested in making mini-me's, right? They have their own niche that they do, and they want to guide you, but they want you to figure out your own path. Because they are obvious, for obvious reasons too, they don't want to create competition. So it's okay to have alignment, but not a perfect match in terms of research. Because I feel like some people try to demonstrate that perfect match, and that's actually can work against you. And then also make sure you mention the program. Don't focus too narrowly on the faculty, because ultimately the faculty member is not the only one deciding if you get in, right? So why do you like the program? Look at the mission statement, borrow some of their language that fits with the way you feel about that program. And just make sure not to skip that part. And sometimes even the university. I sometimes mention both. If there was a particular reason why I chose UT, then I might also throw that in. And then always end on a positive note, right? In general, for this whole thing, anything you want to say, if it comes out negative at all, figure out the way to say it in the positive. Nothing should be negative. The whole thing should be motivating and exciting, and really be like a progression of, yes, this person should come here. Like they totally fit with our program. So definitely nothing negative at any point. And then if you want to see more detail on this, I pulled it. There's plenty of websites out there actually that go over this information, but I thought UC Berkeley did a nice job of really breaking it down step by step. So how do you do it? Start 2 to 3 months ahead of time. Ideally, I think I did mine in a month, and it was extremely stressful, and I had a lot of help and a lot of late nights. And I would not recommend it. If I were to do it all over again, I definitely would have started earlier. So don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do. But obviously, if you do end up doing it starting a month ahead of time, like you can do it. It's probably not going to be your best work. So just keep that in mind. Outline your sections first. So don't jump into writing unless that works for you. It's never really worked for me. I found it was easier if I chunked it out and I just said, I'm going to focus on this paragraph, or I'm going to focus on what do I want to convey about my past research experience? What do I want to convey about my interests? And wrote paragraphs and then kind of figured out how they go together. Tackle in pieces, like I said, and avoid comparison early on. I'm like really torn on whether or not I should share my personal statement with you, because I think it was helpful at one point to look at another statement, but I think doing it too early also made me go, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get there. Like, this is so good. How am I going to get to that point? And I can't do it. And so for me, it was really hard to see really good examples, because then everything I did never stacked up, right? So it was better to compare later on once I had a bit of a draft ready. And then I started asking around, especially to people that were going to read it. Do you mind if I see yours? That might help be helpful. And so that was better later to start doing that. Getting feedback from career specialists can be really helpful. The nice thing about UT is you have lots of resources available to you as an undergrad or as an alum, so you can continue to come back and access these services. We have career coaches, counselors like Adria, and I'm currently doing a student counseling position with TCE, but also your faculty and academic peers might be good people. So especially when I say peers, I mean near peers, people who are maybe a couple years ahead of you. Maybe you met in a student organization or a fraternity, sorority type situation. And, maybe they didn't even go into your specific field, but they went to grad school. So maybe, asking them to give it a read as well, because sometimes faculty are hard to nail down and get feedback from, but usually your letter writers, or at least one of them, is willing, especially if you ask far enough in advance, to give feedback. A couple times I gave feedback to students simply because I felt like they needed it. They didn't even ask me. I wouldn't expect that from faculty, but it could happen. And then in general, if you're applying to multiple programs, which you should be because you don't put all your eggs in one basket, don't feel like you need to write a new statement for every school. There's a caveat to that, which we can talk about for some masters of programs that are applied that don't ask for a statement, but ask you to answer a series of questions. I've seen that become more common. In that case, you can still reuse material, but just adjust it a little bit. So, but what I do recommend is adjust the language to fit each program. So there were always like keywords in mind that I would adjust depending on the program. So maybe in one of them, they had more of a focus on positive psychology. So I would go through and add that term in occasionally, instead of maybe meditation science or contemplative practices, right? So the two I kind of used interchangeably depending on the program. Both are my interests, neither's a lie. It was just kind of like I wanted to make sure that I really demonstrated why I was a good fit for that program. It also shows that you actually did your homework and like read about the program and the professor. If you send in a really generic one that seems somewhat generic, like you sent it to everywhere, faculty can kind of pick up on that, and they might kind of, I've seen faculty sort of judge that as, this person's probably not too serious about our program. Okay, CVs and resumes. Or should we stop there, Adria, and do questions? Okay, cool. Let's do a quick stop and just talk about CVs for a minute. Or I'm sorry, talk about statements.
Yeah, we had some great questions about what to do during gap years, and also like how personal to get in the statements in terms of what is revealed, especially if it's related to, you haven't been able to do certain things, So there was, I think a general question around how to make those decisions, I think could be really helpful.
Sure. Yeah, let's start with gap year. So first off with gap year, obviously, if you weren't in the last session, let your letter writers know that you plan on taking a gap year and ask them now while you're still in undergrad for those letters. That aside, in terms of work experience, I guess what's the exact question here? Will this prevent? Oh, how do you talk about it without revealing too much? Well, so I have two thoughts on that, and Adria, jump in if you want here. My first thought is in some fields, your reason or your interest might come from something like a disability, right? I'm interested in mental health because I've seen how hard it was for my brother to struggle with depression, or my personal self, right? So how do you talk about that without professionally, without making it seem like I might be unfit, right? You shouldn't, ideally that shouldn't come across. Here's the way that you work it. You can mention these things if it is relevant to your interests, right? So it's okay to say that in brief, but you don't want it to overwhelm your statement. You don't want it to seem like you're going to grad school to fix yourself. This is especially true. You see that in like mental health fields. And so oftentimes I say, put it in that first paragraph where you are talking about your interest and how it developed. And you can say it, but say it very matter-of-factly, and say it like you've worked on it, and it's not, it's something that you are managing. It's managed in some way. You don't have to say that, but just don't come off as like, I can't control this and it's going to get in the way throughout grad school. I hope that kind of helps. For me, I definitely threw that in my statement. There were some things that happened that definitely influenced my decision to go into mental health. And I mentioned it, but I definitely mentioned it almost like in passing, like this happened, and now I understand more deeply the dynamics of X, and that's why I wanted to do Y. So there's one way. If it's related to your interests, you can talk about it. Don't be afraid of talking about it. Just don't make it be the whole statement. Don't come back to it multiple times. Talk more about who you are as an academic and your scholarly potential, because that's what's important, not your disability. So then in terms of if you don't want to disclose it, I don't know, that's a harder situation. Obviously you don't have to. You might say, well, okay, so here's what I would say. In your statement, you don't really have to talk about it at all. Like, you don't have to talk about the gap year. Just pay attention to what has made you a good fit for this program and where your interests are now, what you did in undergrad. What I would recommend is doing a non-chronological statement. And what that means is you break it up more in terms of these experiences taught me X and these experiences taught me Y, instead of first I did this, then I did that. Chronological works for some people, and non-chronological is perfectly fine. I would say that's actually the preference, because when you did it doesn't necessarily matter. It's that you did it, right? You had that experience. So I just wouldn't bring it up at all. I wouldn't even bring up that you have a gap year or gap years. If you feel like it is an issue and you want to address it, there's usually some sort of, like, you can add an extra statement that is specifically to address any potential issues with your application. And it's not in your personal statement. Normally it's something that you can amend, you can add it, but you're not required to. In general, what I've experienced is if you do that, keep it brief. Like I said, matter of fact, don't go into too much detail, kind of like you would with, if you've been a part of SSD and you see, you don't have to disclose what it is. You just say that there were medical issues that required time and space to take some time, and now you feel ready and capable of coming back to grad school. But honestly, the advice I always received was like, you don't really have to say anything. Like, it's probably better to just not even bring it up, unless it's like 10 years, like if it's a substantial amount of time, that's a big gap on your resume, then maybe, but a couple of years is totally normal for grad school, taking those gap years. Adria, what would you add to that? I feel like I'm out.
I thought you did a great job of sort of addressing the complexity. I think it's talk about what you feel comfortable talking about, keep it brief. I think this is when getting some eyes on it, like coming and seeing us and having us read through so that we can say, how we're perceiving things, because I think sometimes we read over our things and it's our life, so it really makes sense. But, to come and have somebody else who doesn't know you take a look, I think that can be very, very helpful, especially for situations, and all of our lives are complicated. We all have stuff that could go into a personal statement. It's like, so having a little bit of guidance around what makes sense and how it will improve your application, I think is critical.
I'm muted. Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts about gap year? Feel free to throw them in the chat if we didn't get to your specific question. So then the next thing that came up was, I'm seeing a lot of gap year stuff. Was there something else, Adria, I'm missing?
I think that was it. I think just addressing the complexity of what to choose to include, and then gap year. I like how you talked about, and you'll notice for grad school, the average age for many programs is older. I mean, a lot of people have gone out and gotten experiences, whether it's practical or research experiences or work experience or all of the above. So in that way, you don't really have to kind of account for the months or even years that you were out. It's kind of expected that a lot of people will go out, and I think one of the things just to think about it from COVID is you may have a little bit more or different of a gap because you haven't been able to engage in some of the things you might ordinarily have been able to engage in. So everybody will have that will be sort of across the board for grad students. So come talk to us with your specifics and we can help you come up with a plan on how to address and go from there.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add too is if you can take on like a remote part-time thing, like I know crisis hotlines twice a month, if you can do 12-hour shift or whatever, they'll forward it to your cell phone. Or, in mental health, I know there's lots of experiences that you can do remotely that wouldn't require quite as much commitment as a full-time job. So if full-time work isn't an option, maybe think about other ways that you might add to that. And if, even anything that's like time sensitive isn't going to work for whatever reason, do some LinkedIn learning courses, like add things that you've done to show you're committed to the field. So stuff that you can do asynchronously on your own time. So add, certifications from Linda or whatever, or what's it called, LinkedIn Learning, and other things like that. So especially while you're still with UT, you can always kind of access those things for free. Oh, what if your undergrad interests are pretty different from your, or graduate interests are different from undergrad degree? How much do you focus on the undergrad degree? Right. So would like to focus on smaller project for the topic, and I'm actually interested in pursuing the year-long project for my degree, or both. Not sure I understand the last part of that. If you want to elaborate, Melanie.
I guess I'm just asking, like, if I'm not pursuing the same kind of topic as my undergrad degree, but I have more experience, like a year in a research lab for that degree, would I focus on that research experience, or say like a paper that is more in line with what I want to pursue, but like a bit smaller in scale? I guess it's like, what do I focus on, just because I have less experience in that actual field?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think all of it. I think you do still talk about your undergrad degree, but you talk about the transferable skills. So you talk about, like, so for example, someone in my lab has an undergrad degree in English, but is now doing a PhD in counseling psychology. So definitely not aligned. I mean, but you can still talk about how writing is important in graduate school and communication. And so what did you learn in your undergrad degree that would help prepare you for graduate school, even if it's not content like of that area? There's still something that you learned that's, across all, like the writing flags and all those flagged courses that all students do. You can at minimum talk about those. And those skills. So, but you're right, I wouldn't give a ton of attention to your undergrad degree because that's not really what you're standing on. And if like if there were experiences you had in that degree that made you realize that that wasn't the path for you, you can talk about that. Like, how did you know this wasn't the path, and how did you figure out that you wanted to go this other direction? Again, keeping it all positive. That's when things can kind of be easy to go negative. I didn't like this. So instead be like, I learned that this wasn't for me because of X, Y, and Z, or I learned I'm really good at this, which wasn't really reflected in my undergrad degree. So I pursued these other experiences in this research lab and learned that this was really wonderful. And I really loved X, Y, Z about that. So you can use the undergrad as like, here's why I don't want to do that. But always kind of frame it in the positive of what did you learn? What did you grow? That was some advice I received, which is, what was the experience? What did you learn? What did that lead to? What was that experience? What did you learn? What did it lead to? And that was really nice to just get me started. It's not the like perfect formula for the essay, but it worked really well for me to be like, okay, right. It's not about necessarily being boastful and saying, here's a list of all the things I've done, because that's your CV. It's more of what did I learn from those experiences that are important. And what I see it as is you're guiding the reader through your CV. So you don't necessarily need to go in the same order as your CV, but you're saying, hey, look, highlight this experience, go look at it at my CV. So you also don't need to say everything about that experience. A lot of it's on your CV. So you don't need to say, like, I presented this specific title presentation at this specific conference. You can just say my experience resulted in a poster presentation at a national conference. And from that, I learned, the value of disseminating my research findings and how great it is to network with, peers in my field. So you don't need to say exactly that I did this specific conference. You can just point to it, and then they'll go to your CV and say, oh, look, she presented at this really competitive national conference. Cool. Yeah, so Adria added here, you're telling your story, highlighting those skills that make you a good choice or a good candidate for grad school. Hopefully that helps. I know I just talked a lot. Are we ready to talk CVs before we run out of time? Let's do it. Okay.
While you're getting that, I am just going to, I was going to say that I'm going to be sharing some documents with you in the chat. So you'll want to grab those and save those. The first one I'm going to send is about grad school essays, just like Cassandra's been talking about. And then I'm also going to do a CV writing one, and maybe even a transferable skills handout that could be helpful. So I'll do those three. Great. Sorry about that, Cassandra. Back to you.
No, you're good. That's perfect. Yeah, in case anyone has to jump out early, it's good to get those out there. And then there's also at the end here, I've got a few links as well in terms of resources. Okay, let's jump in here. Okay, so the basics, both communicate your qualifications. A CV, though, is technically a record of your lifetime academic work. So it's usually longer. There's no page limit, and it can sometimes include things that you wouldn't put on a resume, usually like publications and whatnot. Ultimately, which to do just depends on which is required. I've noticed more programs are going to an either or situation, but some still very much require a specific form. And master's degrees might be more amenable to resumes, and PhD programs are likely to want a CV. So let's start with resumes, because that's probably what you're most familiar with. Obviously, communicate your relevant qualifications and experiences. That's kind of the overarching idea. 2-page limit. Use your white space. I think the biggest thing I see in some of the templates that are out there, even at UT, really try to cram a lot of information into a small space. Don't feel pressured to do that. It's okay to take up 2 pages. If you've made it to the point where they are looking at your resume, they are actually going to look at it. They're not going to just kind of like flip through it really quick. It's not the same as in a hiring situation. So feel free to use that white space. It makes it more approachable. People want to read it. Take a look. I always take a look from a distance first, not the content. I just say, do I want to read this document? If you don't want to read that document, then you're probably trying to squish too much into one space. That's just a really personal pet peeve of mine, as you can tell. So that might not be everybody's experience, but I really hate it when when somebody tries to fit everything on one page, but it could very easily be a nice 2-page resume. Leave off your unrelated work experience. That's up to you. But in general, when you're applying to, and again, this is not coming from experience here. I used a CV. I did not do a resume. So just that disclaimer right now. But when I've reviewed people's resumes for grad school, they tend to make it pretty specific to that field. Or if they have something that's, not related, in the bullet points, they will definitely highlight how those skills they learned in that experience are related to what they want to do. So maybe you worked in fast food as a shift supervisor, you'd want to highlight those leadership skills that are really good for now your master's in education administration, right? So things like that, especially if you need those experiences to fill out the page. However, definitely highlight anything you did in undergrad, organizations you were a part of, projects you worked on, research labs, and the actual format can vary a little bit. Maybe you want to break it up by research experience and work experience. That's totally fine. Or volunteer experience. There's not one specific way of doing it. So don't feel cornered into a specific template. What else? I would also say, if you're really confused or you're not sure if this is right, you could always reach out to the graduate coordinator of a specific program and just kind of even say, I know your time's limited, but I'm wondering if this is the format or whatever that people typically use to apply to this program. It's worth a shot. I'm not going to guarantee you're going to get feedback that way. Definitely go to TCE or any of the career counseling centers. That's your best bet. But again, so those are some of your options. And then LinkedIn Learning, I'm going to put the instructions in the chat when I'm done here, but there's a really great course. It's about an hour long, bunch of different videos on how to write a resume. And they do have one on CVs as well. So technically a CV is a curriculum vitae or vita. I have looked up extensively how to pronounce this and which is right, and there's no consensus, so just call it a CV, is what I learned from that. Vitae means plural, vita means singular. I'm not at all skilled in Latin, but it basically means life, right? So it's like your academic life. And you want to be very specific to your academic and professional accomplishments. So absolutely leave off unrelevant work experience in this situation. And I don't know if Adria would agree with that, but I think that's my understanding, is that you wouldn't, even if you don't have a lot to put on here, you wouldn't add like anything that's not clearly relevant. If you want to go into school psychology and you nannied, maybe you could like kind of bridge that, but for the most part, you just want to stick to anything you did in undergrad here. No page limit. Students can give more detail. So this is why I want to be clear that your faculty all have CVs and would probably be more than willing to share them. You can find them online. But the problem is they are so accomplished that they don't need a lot of detail. They can just list a bunch of stuff. It looks like a long laundry list of things. Yours can be more detailed, and I can show you an example of what mine was early on and how I gave more detail. Leave off unrelated work experience, and then LinkedIn Learning also has, that same course has a nice short video on US CVs. Be careful, in Europe, a CV is like a resume. So US CVs are different than European CVs. Lastly, you might, if you've already started looking into schools, see more and more schools asking for diversity statements. I came from California, and I can tell you right now that all the UCs require a diversity statement. I applied to 2, and I wrote 2 statements for UCLA and UC Santa Barbara. And sometimes you're given a prompt, usually not. Well, they'll give you an extremely broad prompt that allows you to kind of go any direction you want. Here, what my impression is that what they're assessing is your development and commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So there's a lot you can say there, and there's a lot of directions you can go. I think the biggest thing I'd recommend is checking out your specific program, department, and their university. They usually always have a diversity statement, especially if they're asking for one. They've probably got their own posted online, and just see kind of like where they stand on things. What are things that they value? And think about how you have either done your own personal growth in those areas, or what you intend to do, or where you're at. And speak to those areas. Just be honest about where you're at. This is definitely not the place to try to play it up. You're not expected to, it's a lifelong journey. There's no like destination. So they're just trying to assess that where you're at on the path. And mostly they're trying to make sure that like you're in line with their values for that program. And this is going to be very different. If you're applying to small liberal arts schools that are, have a very specific mission, this may not be a diversity statement. It might be like your commitment to your religion or something like that. Like you might be asked to speak to that if you want to go to a Christian university or, something like that. So diversity statements are just really common in schools like UT and some of the big schools that are publicly funded and are more liberal leaning. Okay, and then lastly, I was just gonna potentially show you my CV here and then kind of jump into your questions depending on time. And there are some resources I can, usually I make a slide for this. I can put these in the chat, I think. But these are all links to the different resources you have at UT, Texas Career Engagement, where Adria and I are from. And then the University Writing Center, you can always set up an appointment with them to look it over for more like grammar and spelling and things like that. And then LinkedIn Learning has a lot of great courses on this stuff too, if you want to do some of your own private stuff. Okay, and stop share. So what do we have going on over here? So Adria put up a bunch of resources, and there's a consultant. Yeah, okay, cool. So somebody's used a consultant at the University Writing Center. Okay, awesome. Thank you for that recommendation. Any questions about this specific piece while I pull up my CV? Is there a template? Yeah, I wish there was. I'm not sure. You could probably find some online. I just it's kind of a beast that just keeps morphing with the years. So once you get started, there's certain areas you need to hit, but I don't know if there's a template. The biggest thing is keep it simple. Don't add a bunch of colors and like distracting lines. Keep it really straightforward. Let me find an older one of mine because I've been, let's see.
And on the last page of the handout I sent you, there's the start of a short CV there as well. But I think, yes, keeping it simple, and it does kind of evolve over time as you get more experience. And
yeah, one of the professors I had in undergrad had a really great recommendation, which was to add more detail when you're a student, like describe what you did, because people don't know and you oftentimes just don't have a lot to put on there. So it also kind of helps to make it feel rich, right? Your experience. So this was in 2017. I had recently completed my master's degree. Fortunately, it would probably take me too long to find one from undergrad, but you know, name, put what it is, update the year. Those are standard. Always have that. Your current institution where you're at, you know, contact information. Education as a student is probably going to be your top category. So put that first and reverse chronological. You can include GPAs, and that's very much expected. Thesis, you know, if you did an undergrad thesis, you can add that with the title. But one thing I see people screw up here is, or do, that's not helpful, is to try to add a lot of information in the education section. Be very brief here. Just say exactly what the degrees were. Don't try to make it too complicated. Later, you can talk about that. Depending on what seems most important, like if you have a lot of grants or awards or anything like that, you can add that next. You might want to skip this section or put it later if you just don't have a lot to say. But this is what I mean by adding descriptions. So for everything I put description, poster presentation recognized for outstanding research contribution, right? So like this one's kind of straightforward. Regional Research Award kind of says what it is, but some of them aren't, especially fellowships. So let me find a good one. So the Tommy Young Memorial Scholarship, you wouldn't know what the heck that is unless you read the description. So recognized for academic resilience and demonstrated commitment to promise for work in the field of psychology. Now that I'm like later on in my career, I've removed all these descriptions. That's just too long and people don't want to read it. It's too much. But if you're earlier on, this can be really helpful. So again, another description that says, can really, you know, you can be a little, not boastful here, but it's okay to be really accurate about what it is, you know. So faculty selected scholarship for dedication to and enthusiasm for research, one of 2 graduate student recipients. Like, I'm trying to tell people that like this was not easy to get, right? Like, and I want them to know that not everybody in the program was just handed out this fellowship. And then academic experience. So this must have been for some sort of academic role. Just keep that in mind too. I always reorder my sections depending on what I'm sending it for. If I'm looking for a job as a teacher, I would put academic first. If I'm looking for research, I'd put research first. So you can reorder things. For research experience, you can put your lab. Again, this is just my personal format. This wasn't anything I found online. You can do it however you want. But since I was in more than one lab, I kind of put the name of the lab and then the different projects I worked on. and my responsibilities in those labs. So that can be really helpful. But again, mine got a little too much. And this is about the time when I started taking a lot of this out. What else? Let's skip over this. Publications. You probably don't have journal articles at this point, and that's okay. I've heard mixed on this. Some people say leave the header, but I say just take it out. But do have a publication section, because that can include, or skip that and just do scholarly presentations. Like these titles are all just stuff I made up, right? None of it's like set in stone. So you can call it whatever you want. You can collapse these two, or you can separate them out. And then, yeah, so here I separated out like things that I presented at like workshops, symposia versus poster presentations, in part because I have a lot of posters and I didn't want these to get lost in the mix. I wanted people to know that I've actually presented papers too. And then I'm going to skip over this and get down to, and I just want to acknowledge too that I remember seeing somebody's CV when I was an undergrad and being like, oh my God, is that what's required? Like, no. And especially my route was really unusual. So this is after a master's degree. This is after working for a year as a like professional in research. Like this is like, you know, this is way further in the process too. So don't feel like your CV needs to look like this. That's not, you're not being compared to this, you're being compared to other people with undergrad experience, and that's very different. What is this?
So that was a great thing to throw out, Cassandra, because you have a very impressive CV. So, which congratulations, but also, yes, I mean, it'll grow and evolve as you go through grad school and as you have more experiences. So certainly look at Cassandra's, and all of her advice is spot on. And then look at the example in the handout I gave you. I think it's probably going to be more reflective of what yours is going to have at this point in your career. And there are a lot of titles, like examples of titles you can use. And so, but yes, I think Cassandra's is something to kind of aim for.
Right, but it's years in the making, right?
Yes.
Like this is a long time being invested in research. So keep that in mind. And what was the other thing I was going to say? This is the part I was trying to get to. You usually have a section on certification. So if you've done any, like if you've worked in a research lab, you've probably taken some sort of ethics training. And then also any society, like conferences you've attended. So I've also seen that, like conference attendance. So even if you didn't present and you went, and you want people to know that, because that's important. It shows dedication to your field. You can have a section on conferences, affiliations. Sometimes it, you know, as a student, you can still kind of leave on old ones, but typically as you progress through, you'll drop those off and just say what you're currently a member of. But that's it. I've seen other sections too. So just kind of, again, there's a variety of ways of doing this. What else? Any questions about CVs? Oh, I was going to say that your CV at this point is probably going to be about the same length as a resume, like a page to 2 pages. It's not going to be longer than that, and that's very normal at this stage applying for grad school. See anything new in the chat? Capstone, right? You can really play up your educational experiences, relevant coursework. Those are just fields that I dropped because it just didn't seem relevant anymore. But if you were earlier on, those would be really important to highlight. We've got about 5 minutes left. I know we have just a quick survey on what you got out of this and how was it for you. So that's always really helpful for us. So please do stick around and take that. Any last questions while we throw the survey out?
I'm going to launch it now.
Cool. Oh, and you know what? I'll pull those links out as well. Throw those in the chat.
And Cassandra and I are available for individual appointments. She'll be available through the end of May, and I'm a staff member, so I'll be available, you know, for the foreseeable future. So all of these grad school planning has so many steps. So you're absolutely welcome to come at any stage, and you're welcome to come 1 year out after graduation. So just keep this in mind as a resource for you down the road.
So in the chat, before everybody takes off, there's the direct link to TCE's undergrad webpage, and then the undergrad resources at the University Writing Center. And then lastly, because this can be confusing, login instructions for LinkedIn Learning, because for some weird reason it's challenging.
It is.
I know, it's bizarre, but you do get it for free through UT, so don't pay for it is the takeaway. And if you type in, I think it'll ask, like, you can type in the university and it'll take you to the single sign on, and then that'll get you in. Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for coming. It's lovely to do this. I'm glad we got to do it. So hopefully we'll be able to do it again next year, or someone will, not me.
Definitely. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I will be sending out the recording.